again. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We are delighted to be hosting Matt Sienkiewicz, who is the co-author of this book, which you probably all heard about, That's Not Funny, which is one of the Vulture's top best comedy books of 2022. Matt is an associate professor and chair of the Boston College Communication Department, in addition to his work on this book. And he is in conversation tonight with Ross Barkan, who is the author of 3 books, including The Night Burns Bright, a novel published last year. His reporting and essays appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The Nation, New York Magazine, and many other publications. Before I turn it over to our distinguished guest tonight, let's talk a little bit of housekeeping. Please do keep your masks on during the event. We're monitoring the ventilation in here, and if we need to, we will prop the door open a little bit just to air it out. Also, if you have not already, please silence your phones so that we are not also competing the train that goes by. And if you have not already, you can redeem your $5 ticket for tonight towards the cost of a copy of Matt's book, which I'm sure he'll be more than happy to sign for you at the end of the event, or towards any other book that you decide to purchase tonight. Thank you again so much for coming. We couldn't do our events and programming without you, and we hope we'll see you next week. Tuesday evening, we're going to be hosting a book on the history of Queens called Famous People of Queens by Rob McKay, who is formerly of QVC and a director of the Greater Restorative Historical Society. You can sign up for a newsletter on our website or register, and once the train goes by and we have a little bit of quiet again, I will turn things over to Matt and Ross. Thank you so much.
All right, well, welcome. That's very exciting. I'm very excited to be here to chat with Matt. I think what we might do is, instead of read from the book, we're going to have a little discussion kind of about the books. It's really fascinating. I got to read it last year and actually write a piece about it, which is a lot of fun. And then we'll do Q&A, right? You can ask Matt whatever questions you have. So, we'll get started. This, I guess I'll ask up front, and then we'll kind of go from there. Explain for the audience, what is your book about, and particularly what is the conservative or right-wing comedy complex? It's something you write very well about.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. And thank you to everybody for coming out. It's really great to support smaller books, right? Books from university presses. Don't get a lot of sort of professional PR. It's really great to have people come out. I want to thank Dave Moss in particular for finding the book and tweeting about it, and actually that's why we're here. So thanks to Dave, and of course thanks to Ross and the bookshop for hosting it. This is a book that makes an argument, first and foremost, that like it or not, conservative comedy exists. It is a commercially impactful and powerful place, and it is also a politically impactful and powerful place. And that, for some people, that's obvious, and for other people, it's not at all. There is a lot of sort of political possessiveness that comes to talking about comedy. Everybody wants to be funny, right? Everybody wants to be perceived as funny. Everybody wants to date someone who's funny. Everybody wants funny to be who you are. And when political identities are strong, everybody wants comedy to be associated with your political identity. There's a lot of writing out there, be it academic or be it in sort of punditry world, tries to make an argument that no, only my side, and often the liberal side, right, has comedy. There's a whole, set of books in the academic world that sort of make those arguments. So this pushes on those by pointing to the existence of what we call the right-wing comedy complex. So what does that mean? That means that while there's not major famous institutions that you might be familiar with, such as sort of the center-left comedy world has, the SNLs, the Daily Show, right? There's not that so much. Although they're emerging. We could talk about some of the sort of contenders to be that. What there is a network of small, sometimes new media, sometimes cable, sometimes here, there, and there, but these different shows, different comedic outlets that are doing right-wing comedy in slightly different ways that kind of tie together and allow somebody who's curious about the right-wing world to find a comedy entry point into it. And what makes that complex is that you kind of can find your way to other parts of it by podcasts that have guest hosting arrangements where they come in and they trade as guests. Algorithmic suggestions, if you like this particular comedian, it will feature you and filter you towards these other comedians in that world, where when you add up the totality of these characters, and who are the characters, there are people like Greg Gutfeld, people like Steven Crowder, people like Joe Rogan, you could talk about as sort of an interesting character. And certainly a lot of the guests that are on Joe Rogan, the Legion of Skanks, these kinds of people. If you haven't heard of them, it's okay, that's kind of the point. But what they do really effectively is tie themselves together into this complex that, in totality, right, creates a rather large space for people looking for conservative comedy, and all with their own little individual flavors, right? Part of it leans more libertarian, a little more nationalist, this, that, and the other. So that's the idea, is that this complex exists, it stretches out, it goes into some deep, awful places. We can talk about sort of the fascist trolls and the Nazis that tie into this world also. But anyway, that's kind of the idea. It's very easy to miss it, right? Because it doesn't have that one big thing. It doesn't have SNL. It doesn't have, the 90s or 2000s Daily Show. But it's there, it's powerful, it makes a lot of money, and I think we argue that it's also politically important.
Yeah, something I'll poll the audience. How many of you know Greg Gutfeld and watched him before? A decent number, because usually there are a lot of people who give like a blank stare. We actually got, of course, I said Jimmy Kimmel, right? Every hand would go up. But who is watched more these days? Is it Kimmel or Gutfeld? Is it even close?
It is not even close, right? When it comes to late night comedy ratings, I feel like maybe this has bubbled up, and maybe the book even helped a little bit.
Right.
Bubble this
For
up
Gutfeld's, like, I feel like since your book is like slowly permeating the left of center consciousness a bit.
A little bit.
And explain who he is too. 'Cause
Yeah.
Not everyone raised their hand.
So
Right.
Gutfeld,
Who's is it Gutfeld or Kimmel that is actually
Oh, Gut-
popular?
Gutfeld's considerably more. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So most nights, the late night show with the best raw numbers is Gutfeld. Greg Gutfeld show on Fox News.
Is that true when you add up all three of the comedy hosts? And
Yes. So he will always be Kimmel.
I mean, when you add up ABC.
No,
CBS,
we can talk about that. Yes or no? No. There could be nights, but no, generally not. But he certainly is beating Kimmel easily. He beats Fallon almost always. Colbert can challenge him. It is true that there's some extent to which those three, if you sort of view them as teams, you could say like, oh, it's not fair because he gets to have the whole right-wing world. But these guys are also on broadcast, right? And that distinction still matters when it comes to numbers. And also, there are plenty of middle-of-the-road types who watch Kimmel and Colbert and so on. So no, you couldn't add up the three, but he's clearly the strongest of that group. And he's consistently, Colbert maybe sometimes, but he's consistently coming out
Right.
on top of all that.
And who is he? For those who've never heard of Greg Gutfeld, I knew a little bit about him before your book, but not. a ton.
Yeah, and he's really important for a couple of reasons. I'll say why he's important, then I'll say who he is, I guess, backwards. But he's important in part because he is sort of the closest thing to that tentpole character in the right-wing comedy world. But also he really shows the way in which the American right-wing media world can develop a star really quietly and really powerfully without having to depend on the traditional star-making tactics that you find elsewhere. So who is he? He's this, he started off in publishing, doing like men's magazines, like FHM was a Maxim, one of those two. Sort of like bro culture-y kind of, stuff. He's very prankster. He's a marketing guy. He'd do these like dumb guerrilla marketing things where he'd go to various places in the city and have people disrupt it, and literally in gorilla suits sometimes. So sort of like a merry prankster thing was his start. And then, coming up now, I think 15 years ago, Fox News, I'm gonna go back one more if it's okay. Famously, Fox News failed in the late aughts with an attempt to make their own daily show. Has anybody heard of the half-hour news hour? Right, so it's this very short-lived attempt to try to, okay, Stewart's killing it over on Comedy Central, we'll make our own. It's actually Joel Surnow, the guy who created 24. That's very odd. It's the guy who created 24. They thought it's like the only sort of reputable Hollywood guy who would take on this project. So they take the guy who made 24 and they have him do a right-wing daily show. It's a disaster, partially because it's just like poorly done, but also very tellingly, and this will get to Gutfeld, I promise. Very tellingly, when they would air the half-hour news hour on Fox News, their daily show, they would have to put up a chyron at the beginning that said, what you're about to see is comedy. Right? So this is comedy. And clearly, so they've got an audience who's not ready for comedy, doesn't understand why comedy would be part of a Fox News program, and it's bad on a number of levels. Like, we could list it other ways, which is not good, and it lasts, 9 episodes. Pretty hilariously terrible. And that's actually when a lot of these academics sort of jump out and say, aha, see, you can't write comedy if you're on the right. So that didn't work, but it was kind of like a temperature shock issue, right? Like they tried to just throw this comedy show into like the Sean Hannity rage world, and it just didn't work. It was sort of like a rejected transplant or something, right? So then what do? They actually got really smart. This is the, Roger Ailes, a lot of terrible things to say about Roger Ailes, and this might be also one of them, but he was quite good at sort of long-term strategy when it comes to media. And he realized, all right, that's the problem, is that they went too hard at it. It's not going to work. And instead what they did is they gave Greg Gutfeld, this merry prankster guy, a show called Red Eye. Who saw Red Eye? So Red Eye was an overnight show, like a 3 a.m. show on Fox News. And they would let him do really wild stuff. It generally had a sort of a conservative bent, but he was kind of more of a libertarian guy. It was a little bit all over the place. He would do some interesting satire even of Fox News, right? So like there's the famous Fox News leg shot, where they take like the tall, skinny ladies and they like use the high angle, right? But he would like do those in like super extreme to sort of parody those, right? He would do bits on Red Eye where like the talking heads will get up to like 5 or 6 and it's annoying on cable news. He would do like 17, and they would just talk like clever stuff. It would actually work quite well. A lot of it was like sort of satirizing it, and then other times it was dumb. Like Steven Crowder's on there talking about abstinence only stuff. Like there's a lot of like really silly and not good. But anyway, there's a mix of things, and they noticed that it actually proportionally kind of kills in the 3 a.m. slot. Right, which isn't saying like a whole lot, but it did say, all right, there's people who know what number Fox News is, and they like comedy, and okay, if in 2005 they're up at 4 a.m. or whatever, they're probably young or just insomniac, right? But okay, there's like an audience there, and they realize, okay, what we can do is we'll start taking Gutfeld and we'll like pull him into more and more like regular parts of the schedule. And so he starts showing up as a pundit on this show and that show. And eventually that kind of builds up and they give him a weekly evening show. But they don't just give him a weekly evening show. They also put him on the show called The Five. It's like their afternoon show. To do like, bits that are satiric or just be like sort of a ironic commentator or whatever. And they start dropping it a little bit more. The late night, the weekly show starts doing better and better. It really has sort of a bump when Trump takes over. We can talk about that. He does actually some interesting stuff with Trump. And then, after that's sort of been established, we're now 10 years past the failure of the half-hour news hour. Now, the audience has been built up, and they have created their own comedic star without breaking outside in any way into the regular star system. And so now he's the only guy out there who can draw those millions of numbers. And it's also a coherent demographic, right? When you look at demographics for advertising-based media, you want raw numbers, but you also want coherence, so you can know what to advertise to them. It's actually really, really powerful. And he becomes a launching point for all these other comedians. So virtually everybody else who we talk about in the book who's part of that complex, right, you can tie to Greg Gutfeld. Either he's a guest on Gutfeld, or Gutfeld does op-eds like Rogan, for example, who would not appear on Gutfeld, I don't think, but Gutfeld will defend Rogan's this or that when he says something. When he has the COVID guy, they have the COVID deniers on, or whatever the case might be. So it becomes sort of we call it sort of like the big box store of the complex. It's like the Target, right? Everything's sort of in there, and it can kind of branch out from there.
Yeah. And so you start with Gutfeld, who's now the king of this. And I guess I would ask, why do you think he has been so successful? Why is he beating these much more famous people, even today? People know Kimmel Fallon, they don't know Gutfeld like that, but he's winning. And so why do you think he's winning?
No, it's a good question. And part of it is a division of audience that you point to amongst the others, but that's not the whole story for sure. Part of it is, so the late night world during the Trump had to sort of embrace being very political and partisan. It's the way it had to go. It was an awkward fit for the other guys.
Yeah. And
Colbert, right? He's trying to do a comedy show, but he's also trying to do good by certain political commitments. That's the thing we're bringing up. But after January 6th, he's crying, right? Instead of doing biting satire, he's sort of showing his bona fides in terms of his liberalism, which in another context might be all right. It's a limitation when it comes to that.
Is it funny?
Right. Whereas Gutfeld is just partisan from day one. News, he doesn't have to be shy about it. I think that the tethering of culture to politics works for him much more cleanly. Even though I would also argue that his least during the Trump years, it was a little more complicated politically than you might think. And now I don't think so. Now it's like basically culture war nonsense stuff every night.
Yeah. Let's talk about then Gutfeld at the top, and then you mentioned Crowder. Obviously, people here would know Joe Rogan, but there's a lot of other popular figures who are not so well known here. So talk a bit about certainly Crowder, but then let's go, I guess, downstairs in the complex, right? And then for Gutfeld really at the top, kind of a broad umbrella. Talk about what's below, what and like you said, it starts from, you know, sort of broadly acceptable conservative, and then you end up in your like literal neo-Nazis, actual fascists, actual anti-Semites. So the words get thrown around a lot. But these are
non-debatable,
explicitly anti-Semitic and fascist. So let's
So we can map it right. Gutfeld, who, you know, at least in the Trump years, is absolutely mainstream Republican.
Right.
And then you have the Daily Shoah, right? So the Shoah is the Hebrew word for the Holocaust, right? It's a pun, right? Or a show called Murdoch, sort of a Nazi. That's like the extremes that you can get, right? And we're really careful to say that you don't turn on Greg Gutfeld and then you're listening to the Daily Shoah. That's silly. However, could you draw are there less transfers on that train trip than there should be? I think there are. So where can we go? You know, there's a number of other things talked about that you mentioned. I'll give quick ones, then we'll get deeper.
Sure.
So Stephen Crowder's the change my mind guy. The guy who like sits out on the campus and like baits like undergrads with his like sort of debate tactic bullshit. You know, you've seen him, he's memed a lot, right? And you know, he's on Blaze. That's Glenn Beck's thing, and a lot of people watch that thing.
Yeah.
Like really tremendous numbers of people watch it in the current fractured media world, right?
Yeah.
And this stuff, some of that stuff, a lot of that's sort of like just dumb partisan. A lot of it actually is very ugly in and of itself. You know, he'll do these like, it's sort of like supposed to be like punked. Basically, he'll go to like a place where people are looking for work who, you know, might not be legally in the country, and will sort of lure them, and then like call the authorities, like really nasty, awful stuff. And that what I would call is fairly mainstream.
Yeah.
Like that's not nearly sort of that basement world. There's this interesting case of Joe Rogan, right? And I think, you know, sort of where you stand would kind of be how you perceive Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
Often, you know, the way we like to describe Rogan in the book is, you know, Joe Rogan doesn't really have politics, he has demographics, right? Joe Rogan is interested in whatever sort of politically unaligned younger men are into. The kind of people who buy fake Viagra and boxes of raw meat, right? That's his business, is selling fake Viagra and like pubic hair trimmers. And so what are they interested in? Right, and that can range from like interesting people who you might love to really nasty people who you might really not love. And you can see this in like the way he does politics, right? So he's a Bernie guy at the beginning of the 2020 cycle, and that's because Joe Rogan cares about but public health care. Okay, fine, but then Sanders jumps out and he's a Trump guy now, who obviously doesn't care at all about public health care. Why? Because if you look at charts of popularity amongst like, you know, 20 to 34-year-old men, right? Bernie was really popular. Trump was actually fairly popular. Biden's very unpopular. So it just gets bypassed, right? And if you look at who he brings on the show, it has people, and this will get us into these darker spaces, right? Probably the one we talk about most is these group of guys called the Legion of Skanks. I think you're familiar with the Legion of Skanks, right? I hate saying that thing out loud, bothers me. It's you know, these are self-described libertarians. But as you might suspect, they're really interested in only a few libertarian issues. One of them would be, you know, getting stoned and talking on a podcast, which is fine by many of us. But then also these sort of like free speech activism as an excuse for being sort of nasty, horrible people, right? So you start with the premise, and actually some of them will do like serious libertarian pieces, and then just see how many times they can say the N-word. See how ugly their Anne Frank jokes can be. They play games where they watch videos of women being hit and asks how justified the person was in hit. Like really nasty, nasty stuff. And you've seen that in other comedy, but the twist on it is that they have this sort of political branding that, oh, they're doing freedom when they do this. Right? They're doing free speech. They're sticking it to the censors. and of course there's no censorship at all. They're doing it, right? But the idea is to sort of point you in that direction. So you can go there, you know, for the Anne Frank jokes, right? And you can go there for the N-word, you can go there for the misogyny. And then they will bring on people who can then pull you a little bit farther. So you got Rogan, Gutfeld's going to talk about Rogan, Rogan's going to bring on Legion of Skanks. Legion of Skanks have their own popular podcast. They'll bring in people like Milo Yiannopoulos, characters like this who are sort of very openly, you know, they'll call themselves trolls and talk about what that means, but you know, these will get you really close into spaces where you're going to find them associating with people or being associated directly with the world of things like The Daily Show, which is still going. It's like a podcast that is structured kind of, it's an audio thing, it's structured kind of like The Daily Show. It certainly is written for comedy, it's written for satire, but it's just the most disgusting fascist Nazi stuff.
One of the interesting things in the book is you get at this sort of liberal triumphalism of like the 2000s, I think of it, where there was this belief that was very widespread that only liberals could be funny, sort of in like the Jon Stewart era. You know, did you quote Frank Rich? I know I found a quote from him, but there's this idea like that sort of well into the 2000s and 2010s that only the left can be funny. I guess what I would ask you is, you know, why do you think, I suppose that's a mistake, and also, why do you think that was? I mean, why was this sort of broadly accepted idea for a long time, right? That only the Stewart types or SNL, which was left-coded, though not always so much, maybe not always, became left-coded.
Yeah,
but why was
it started left-coded too.
Yeah, we started, right, it's very interesting evolution. But why did that idea exist, I suppose, and then why is it mistaken? Because that's kind of why it was.
100%. Yeah, let's do the SNL thing very quick.
Yeah, we can talk about the SNL.
And just very quickly, so that starts as countercultural.
Yeah.
You know, we wouldn't call it radical, right? But it's definitely countercultural. It's branded as being liberal and against the squares, right? For sure. And then in the 80s, like, you know, the Joe Piscopo, Robert Downey, it's definitely Dennis Miller is behind the Weekend Update desk, right? It's definitely less so, and then it's come back towards now being very clearly left-branded. There's a lot of reasons why, but one really important thing to note, we sort of have a sense that like, oh, young people are liberal. That is not true, right? Reagan's best demographic was 18 to 24. And that'll correspond very nicely to when SNL is like a little bit more, you know, it's a little bit less countercultural spread, right? So to some extent, it's just sort of a folly of, I'm complaining with boomers for a lot of time, I guess. But like it's sort of a folly of like that, the rise of mass culture comes with the post-war baby boom, where the young people were, at least self-styled at that point, is very much liberal. And so that sort of gets tethered in, tied in, right? And then we get a second sort of an echo boom, which is probably our fault. Maybe I'll be the elder millennial, young Gen X, whatever I am. Where in the early 2000s, this is some really nerdy stuff in this answer I've learned. But in the early 2000s, right, you have this sort of coalescing of factors. One, this is when TV is starting to break up, but not too much. Right, so like Comedy Central is going for much smaller audiences than SNL is, but still pretty big, sizable audience. Right, and the sort of best way to get at that moment is aiming at, frankly, people like me born in 1980 with sort of a liberal persuasion. That's like the fattest part of the target to hit. Right, so they end up going really hard and finding success with that. You also have at that point a really fun president to mock, and some issues that are very unified for the opposition, the Iraq War being a major one, It's like a really rich target zone. It's a time when the logic and sort of aiming in that space makes sense. And you also have this moment where essentially comedians, Stewart and Colbert, are like the leaders of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, he holds a rally, whatever you thought of the rally for sanity, we can talk about that. But at the very least, that's much more inspiring than a John Kerry speech. Right? It's much more exciting than a Howard Dean or a John Edwards or whatever. So there's that bit of it, right, where it's these big symbolic people who are doing it at the right moment when the young sort of people who are most attracted to advertisers are leaning in that way. It's kind of making sense as like a picture, right? That coalesces with this is, I'm a professor, right? It's also when kind of like media studies boom happens, and that both academics and media are much more into media criticism in that moment. So tons of books get written about this. about the Jon Stewart effect, the Sarah Palin, Tina Fey effect. Social science is produced, and the social science is like true of the moment. The social science tends to be snapshots of reality as opposed to pictures of the sort of souls of people, right? Like the essence of humans or whatever. Anyway, all that comes together to paint a picture that it really seems like, okay, these things are together. And I argue here that that's about media environment, that's about the politics of the moment, that's about a few transcendent talents. And, you know, if you had those conditions, you have those outcomes. Now what we have a much different media environment where there's no need to aim at larger parts of the demographic piece. In fact, the media logic of the last 7, 8 years has been to find a tighter and tighter demographic thing to shoot for, at which point any political strike will work as long as you define it as clearly as possible. Does that kind of make sense? A lot of factors, and that's why these things can exist without us really knowing about them.
Yeah. And I was thinking too as I read this, there was conservative comedy obviously before Donald Trump, right?
Yeah.
But I couldn't help but think, this comedy complex, it gains maybe an energy and an edge. And then also, I'll bundle onto this, my provocative question, is part of Trump's success, or was part of his success, was that he could be funny?
Yeah, for sure. See, the first part, and it's worth noting what we do and don't. And I think your review does this really nicely, so you should check out Ross's review. Their antecedents here, you talk about Andrew Dice Clay.
Yeah, no, I didn't get to Andrew Dice Clay.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Those who remember Andrew Dice Clay, fascinating, extremely remarkably popular comedian in a way where no comedian today, I don't think, starting out at the stage he was in his career, could be that popular where he was selling out Madison Square Garden.
Yeah, no talent, just none. Just totally zero. Just all attitude, which there is like sort of a Trump precursor in that also. So yeah, certainly there is. We're talking about sort of specifically these intertwined institutions in the book. We don't do so much on the antecedents. The Trump question is always there, and it's, 100%. I don't think, we call the book That's Not Funny, because we don't have to say that you're being funny. I do think, and, if you have kids, it's helpful. Funny, you could say he's trying to be funny. Some people find it funny. He's absolutely being playful.
Yeah.
But of course, to be playful sometimes is like one kid whacking the other one over the head with a bowling pin or whatever. Right? There's a certain not taking the rules seriously thing that is part of this branding.
Right.
He is doing insult comedy also. He's giving people stupid nicknames, this and that. But the real thing, go back to Gutfeld for a moment, the real thing he does is give an opportunity for these right-wing voices to paint Democrats as super serious people who take themselves too seriously, in contrast to this guy who doesn't take himself so seriously. And the example that I always bring for this is, you would assume on Fox News Gutfeld would be doing just sort of rah-rah Trump stuff. When Trump's in power, that's not what he's doing at all. He's actually making Trump look ridiculous, intentionally, in really interesting ways, but then sort of getting a meta message that's positive. What do I mean by this? He would do things like so Gutfeld, this is when he had a weekly show, it's the same concept. He would take Trump's most unhinged speeches and edit them to be even more unhinged. And so he would just cut out the moments that so it's one speech, and Trump gets out there and says, "I like trucks." And then just cuts back to Gutfeld. It's like, you like trucks, but what do you think about umbrellas? And it'll cut back to Trump, and it goes, "Umbrellas, they work." And then it'll cut back to Gutfeld, and I was like, "Well, should we sell them wheat?" And cuts back to Trump, "We should sell them wheat." Right? And it goes, and it's just like this ended thing. And the point of it is that this guy's nuts. This speech could not possibly make sense. No speech could have these 25 phrases.
Yeah.
Right? But what's the meta message? The meta message is he's just having fun.
Yeah.
He's just playing. Wasn't it fun to just find all the funny things? And so you've got the mean stuff, and that's part of it too. And a lot of academics will sort of say, okay, he can be mean, but he can also be playful in this way that is, I think, really attractive to certain people and pace over the nasty actual effects of policies and all that other stuff.
Yeah. It seems like there is this idea now where maybe it wasn't true certainly in the 2000s, where maybe because Bush was president, because of how the setup was, the left was not perceived as self-serious. The left was perceived as part of this kind of, yuck it up counterculture, and has the right seized that space, I suppose?
They've seized it, as we say, annoyingly discursively. Doesn't mean it's true, but that it's the thing that gets repeated, even in rather centrist outlets, right? But this is true, right? And this is important because now there's truth to certain things. Jon Stewart is awfully serious now.
Yes.
He's awfully serious, but you have to understand, and it's getting old enough, right? That I'm just going to be speaking to people who don't remember these things. So he did this thing called the Rally for Sanity, which I can't remember. I'm not going to say the number. Tons of people in Washington come out for this, right? And this is a parody of Glenn Beck's, I forget what it's actually called, but Rally for something or whatever. It's like Rally for Values, essentially. Rally for American apple pie kind of bullshit stuff, right? It's the Glenn Beck one is super over serious about how we need to, support American values and all this. And the Rally for Sanity is ironic. You don't have a rally for sanity, right? That's like sort of the joke of it. And that's sort of the discursive context of that one. Yeah, this was supposed to be silly. That was a silly thing for Stewart to do. Now you watch Stewart's show, it's pretty serious. And you might say that's justified by the times. It's sort of a matter of preference on your part. But there's little question that in this complex world, right, sort of the number one thing they are trying to articulate is that the other guys are over serious.
Yeah.
That you can't joke in the other spaces. I mean, this is what half of like the better Gutfeld bits that he does are based on various silly trollish activities that he can do. But if you do that over there, you're canceled.
How much is this also a reflection of the fact that we've lost the tentpole shows, the gathering places? We're in such a fractured landscape compared to the 1970s, 80s, even 90s, where enormous masses of people could watch the same TV show at night, the same comedy, right? You had comedy writers for these popular shows who had to find a way to appeal to a lot of sensibilities, to have a successful, the Cosby Show, All in the Family.
That's the classic one.
And you go onward. I mean, through the night, obviously, Seinfeld and on. And that era is gone.
Yeah.
Plainly, it's gone. I'm just, you sort of allude to it, but I just want to ask you about that a bit. How much of this right-wing comedy complex, of what is now, I guess, left comedy, I mean, where does it stand, and what does the landscape look like in that we don't have those gathering place shows anymore, the gathering place entertainment?
Yeah, no, I'd say there's sort of two stages of that. If you say All in the Family, that's exactly the right one to point to. Right, we're familiar with All in the Family.
Yeah.
We're right in Queens too.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's a perfect place. So All in the Family succeeded more than anything due to ambiguity. Right, due to the fact that you might watch the show and be very clear. This is a satire of Carol O'Connor's conservative perspectives. I'm sitting here in Astoria. I bet that's how you read the show, right? A lot of people read it that way. A lot of people did not read it that way. A lot of people read it as making fun of meatheads.
So I was reading a book about Richard Nixon recently, and Carol O'Connor is the actor who played Archie Bunker. Archie Bunker is the openly racist but lovable, cantankerous conservative. He fights with its meathead, right? The young liberal hippie. And Carol O'Connor himself, the actor, is actually very liberal. He actually, in the 1972 presidential election, he campaigned for John Lindsay, who's running as a Democrat. But what the book kind of got at, which is interesting, what they're getting at too, is that the show could be read a lot of different ways. Like the liberals saw, Archie Bunker, what a schmuck. But then a lot of people out in the vast reaches of America reveled in Archie seemingly punching back on the hippie left, on the new left, and then you had just these enormous audiences finding kind of their own home in the show. And
it's based on a British show, which did the same thing.
Yeah.
And that its success was based on this ambiguity, and that ambiguity made it incredibly powerful in the free network era. Right, well, there's three things on TV. You're trying to get half of all American TV viewers to watch it. So there's that, which things can change, but the current sort of structural dynamics of the media world points to that being foolish strategy. At least that's the common sense now. Doesn't mean it couldn't change. I'm not sure. We can talk about the future, maybe. Anyway, that's for sure. The other thing that's been lost, right, is once things started to fracture a bit, as I sort of mentioned with the Daily Show, it became quite clear, people want to say that by and large, younger, by and large, although I push back a little bit, more liberal people tend to be most into comedy. That is often the case, more often the case than it isn't, even if it's not always the case. So that made sense when you had big shows. To make that sort of the heart of it was a certain gentle liberalism, but you're going to kind of like spread it out, you give enough for other people to bring in, and that could, in theory, have the possibility of kind of dragging people towards that. Right, so you have SNL. SNL, it's like a left, center-left kind of show, but it's got enough in there in like the 90s that's apolitical or like a little bit, and so people who are sort of a little bit more right-wing might sort of be attracted to it and so on. That logic has also disappeared. Right, we're currently, I think, in an extremist version of media fracture, which I don't think is sustainable. I don't think we can all have a TV show made just for us. Which is like essentially the current dynamic. Is we're going to make a show for you, and like the magic of like algorithms and data is going to somehow make this profitable, right? And I think probably that's built on sand. Who knows? But in the current moment, there's really no sort of safe industry incentive to do it. There were a few blips. We read about one of them very famously, the comeback of Roseanne. Do you remember this moment?
Yeah.
They were doing All in the Family.
Yeah.
And it actually worked really, really well
Yeah.
until she couldn't stop. She had to say the quiet part out loud, right? That she's not just sort of conservative, but she's deeply racist, and that was going to come out one way or the other. But that was like a moment where you're like, oh yeah, I mean maybe that could hold the center, but the fact that it was a retread also was relevant there.
I just remember, you reminded me. I have another question I want to ask you, then let us know how we're doing on time. We'll do Q&A, ample Q&A. Tim Allen,
Yeah.
paleo comedy.
Oh yeah, we didn't talk about that.
We didn't talk about fascinating, the term that I really never thought about, paleo comedy, and you bring up Tim Allen, who you all know as sort of the godfather of paleo comedy. Talk about that a little bit. It's a very interesting part of the book.
Yeah, this is a term we invent. We call it paleo comedy. It's a play off of paleoconservative, right? Which is a sort of nativist kind of like values-based sort of often very anti-immigrant and sort of a racial separation, all these sorts of things, right, built into it. And so we use that term, and the sort of thing that struck me with it, the reason that I sort of went with it, is Mike Huckabee, former governor of Arkansas, he would tweet and get incredible traction for these just horrific dad jokes, right? It's like a hot dog pun. Really dumb stuff, and then like there'd be like hot dog pun, stupid other pun, and then like Hillary should be in prison pun or whatever, right? And in fact they would make fun of it on the evening shows, right? But these jokes were so bad that clearly that was the purpose of them, was to be so they were dad jokes, right? They were really bad dad jokes, and you realize, I argue, right? What's happening here is he knows they're bad. What's funny, maybe they're so bad they're good, but even more so, what it is, it's sort of like a nostalgic idea of comedy being the thing that dad does and everybody else has to laugh. Right? The sort of like super patriarchal, dad's at the table, yeah, it's not funny, but the world's in order, and that makes me feel comfortable. Right? That's sort of the Twitter version of that. The TV version of it is Tim Allen retreading Home Improvement, right, on Last Man Standing, where the show is just like sort of, it is so obviously sort of nostalgic dad kind of comedy that, maybe some people are enjoying the jokes, but even more so what they're doing is they're using comedy as a way of sort of thinking back in time, right? As a sort of time machine where when certain people could tell certain jokes, that sort of was an order to the world that makes sense. I think the show's even somewhat aware of this. There are these anachronistic moments where like a kid gets upset, he like goes to all like the places you wouldn't leave it to Beaver. Like he goes to like like he races his dirt bike, and then he goes to like a comic book shop, and it's like very like out of this previous era. The jokes aren't funny, but you recognize them from a time when those were the funny jokes. And it sort of like harkens back to, it's comedy as like a time machine. And of course that time machine includes a lot of patriarchal stuff. There's a lot of that show has a lot of race separation jokes and stuff, like, she should be the maid, and then the neighbors next door need to be marked as black and very clear. Anyway, that's the idea.
And there's also kind of a class component, I feel like, where it's very working class to like middle class or aspirational middle class sort of worlds portrayed in
Yep.
type of comedy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you two final ones, and then we'll do Q&A. One, how do you come to write this book, right? And I was reading, I'm fascinated. You must have absorbed so much comedy and stuff you maybe didn't agree with. So just tell us how you came to write about and make a study of conservative comedy.
Yeah, so the first one's actually a character we didn't talk about. He's really very untalented, but he was very useful. Jesse Waters. Jesse Waters.
Waters World. Yeah.
So Waters, there was two things that happened with Waters World that sort of clued us in why this might be important. One, you know, he is sort of like the Fox News version of Jon Stewart, right? Like he sort of looks the part of like a serious news person, but he isn't, right? And then we realized that that's actually how they're marketing him. We just don't see it that way because we are so stuck with the fact that he's insanely racist, and other things. But if you see the way he's deployed, and the thing that really sold us at first is he did the same bit that the Daily Show did one week. There's this bit called, there was a guy who was making the rounds on like the liberal thing. It's called, a guy who had a company, I think it's called just a bit, right, called Liberal Preppers. And the joke on the Daily Show was just sort of like that nobody liberal will be a prepper, right? And that was the joke, but it was sort of funny. Prepper being somebody who like thinks that the end of the world is coming, and so on. But then we watched, I forget why I was watching this now. But anyway, then the same guy shows up and does the same bit on Waters World, and the joke is like, yeah, liberals would never be preppers because they're all effeminate people who couldn't operate a weapon to save their lives and so on and so forth. And it's the same damn bit. Right, and it's just what we call the edge of irony. It's kind of like both sides of this ironic coin are playing out in the same space. And then you say, well, how is Waters being used? Well, he's on this late night slot. He starts off his show all the same way the Daily Show always used to in its heyday, what we call sort of the media hypocrisy montage. Right, so very often Stewart would start the show like, Fox News says this, and they say, we would never do this, and then he cuts to 10 times where they do this. Or Bush says, this is dumb, and then 10 times the Bush is doing exactly this. This is exactly what Waters is doing with liberal coverage of Trump. And you might have different opinions on it, but the form is identical. So that was sort of one tip-off to it, and gut feel actually quite helped me feel like, okay, this is really a solid case to look at. Yeah. The experiential part, right, I actually had more, my co-author Nick, who's obviously, everything I say goes, Nick came up with all this. I could not listen to Legion of Skanks. The misogyny, I just could not deal with it. So I took Daily Show instead. I actually.
We're both Jewish. You're an observant Jew. That was particularly challenging.
It's challenging, but I felt like okay, this is mine. I'll take this, right? Yeah. And a trick at Boston College because I'm not an intern. It's a Catholic school, so it's tough to find actually go off campus to find a Jewish person who research with me because it's just it's racist and everything else is too. But it's called the Daily Show, right? And so I listened to countless hours of the Daily Show. That almost personally, I'm very familiar with anti-Semitism, and it's hard to surprise me with it. This will go places, but the misogyny in Legion of Skanks would churn my stomach, and so that Nick had to take that on. There are moments of it that are kind of fun. There are a couple comedians we read about who actually think are quite good. It's a one for a friend of mine named Andrew Heaton. There's a podcast called The Political Orphanage. He's calls himself a libertarian, but he if you push him on a lot of issues, you'll find he's actually not quite so doctrinaire about some of the things that you probably find most problematic with it. Anyway, but you'll notice we talk about his work and keep saying, oh, he's not racist actually. There are these moments where you find, but they're fairly. There's not a whole lot of positive reviews in this book. Right? If you're looking for recommendations, a couple of people who actually we think you might like, but it wasn't all bad. But there were some bad ones. And
finally, why I'm going to presume we have a left-leaning audience here in a bookshop in Astoria. Why should left-leaning people, progressive, outright socialist, and so on, why should these people care about conservative comedy?
Yeah, and look, that's a question. Academics, we often don't have to fend with that issue. So it doesn't matter. Right? But I do think, we were trying to make an argument you should care. And so there's a few reasons. One, and it depends how much you fall prey to the assumptions. about politics and comedy having a certain monogamous relationship. Right, for one, it's an intellectual mistake, and if a lot of people care about comedy, and you should be aware of the broad scope of it if it's something you care about. I think it's just a general sort of way to be an intellectual person, is to understand things don't always map on the way you want them to. I do think there are lessons in here. I think that a lot of, I think for a long time, maybe this has finally started to fade a bit, but the idea that, of course, the liberal world will get people who are looking, people who are funny will be attracted to the liberal world. I think that was axiomatic from the year 2000 until fairly recently, and I think that showed up in certain political strategies. I can give examples, but where sort of it's taken for granted you could be very serious because people know you're the funny one. It's just not being funny now.
Yeah.
And that is not true at all anymore. I mean, there's a genderness to this, which is important. But young men who are looking for something that they feel is playful and engaging, and they don't really have deep ideological commitments, very much are more attractive to the people we talk about in here than some of the people who you might be more attracted to if you're sort of aligned in a certain way. So if you're interested in political strategy or prognostication or those sorts of things, I mean, Joe Rogan's incredibly powerful. And the people he puts on there have a certain orientation, and it makes a difference, right? It's not giant numbers of people like All in the Family, but it is a disproportionate number of unaffiliated people, of people who are looking for their politics. Right, and that's where it can be very powerful in terms of coalition building. The other thing I would say, if you're sort of a political science person, political coalitions are always full of contradictions, right? So I mean, everyone's and it's true of the Democratic Party, it's true of every international foreign party, whatever. But Republicans have this, it's often called fusionism, right, where you have somehow the small government, anti-rules people combined with the Christian conservatives, combined with a certain national conservative kind of thing, and they don't agree on much of anything, right? One thing we argue in the book is that part of that glue is actually through comedy.
Yeah.
They can all get together and mock the libs. My favorite example of this, I've heard the Babylon Bee. We didn't talk about the Babylon Bee. This is sort of the right-wing onion. Read about it. It's got its moments, then it's got some real bad moments, and more bad moments over the time, I would argue. But they have a podcast, and they are Christian conservatives. That's their thing. They're also kind of cultural warrior bullshitters too. But they are very much Christian conservatives. They will have on a character like Michael Malice, who's sort of Michael Malice. So he's a sort of anarcho-capitalist kind of guy, and they have nothing in common, right? They can't talk about abortion, certainly. They can't talk about anything, but yet this is the complex works. They can be on the same podcast and just sort of mock the libs on it. And this is how you make sort of election-based coalitions, right? Especially in a two-party system, all right, where you have people and you say, okay, which contradictions can we smooth over? And comedy is a really powerful way to smooth over contradictions. And I think the argument we're making here is that in this right-wing world, they do a really good job of that, of sort of putting aside this and that which they really, really disagree on, and agreeing, okay, well, let's mock the cancel culture, let's mock, gender issues now is sort of the central thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let's do Q&A. We've got questions. We've got so many, gosh.
I'll let you call.
We'll start in the back and we'll work our way up, I suppose. We'll start hands in the back. Go ahead.
Oh.
Yeah, all the way in the back, yeah.
Yeah, so there's obviously a division between right-wing comedy and left-wing comedy. I mean, especially since you talk about it in your book. But is there a timeline for when this trend emerged?
Yeah.
Because if you look at the 70s,
Yeah.
maybe, like when Nixon was involved,
Yeah.
there weren't these divisions. Like, for instance, the Watergate scandal, most Americans didn't think it was funny.
No.
If you look at the New York Times, the coverage around that time.
Yeah.
But if it were to happen today,
Yeah.
let's say where Trump
Yeah.
did some impeachable offense, I mean, you'll be like,
We'll make a fantasy world in which
right,
Trump
exactly.
produces
So,
something.
so, I mean, is there some,
Yeah.
is there some demarcation, time demarcation?
Yeah, no, I think there is. And so, my orientation as somebody who studies media industry, and so I would point to media industry. There's also sort of a partisanization thing that's happening at the same time. But I think it really is, and Ross pointed this with sort of the end of the big tent, right? But the there's a flip that happened. I mean, really, YouTube's a really useful thing to sort of think of as something that kind of flips a switch, right? Where, you know, basically the origins of broadcasting is you try to get as many people as you can. And, you know, it gets, the target audiences get sort of smaller, very gently smaller, up until like the 90s. So like, you know, talk about early radio, well, early radio is one of them. We talk about radio in like the 30s or 40s. They're looking for big audiences, and it only narrows somewhat, not that much, into like the 80s, 90s. Right, in the 2000s, they start, you know, this is when almost most American households have cable, right? This becomes very important, and the internet's becoming part of daily lives. All of a sudden, it gets like gradual, then becomes extremely tight. And YouTube, where literally there's a movie for everybody, right, or a TV or a talk show, a stand-up event. At that point, you have no incentive at all to temper your political takes on things, because you can't expand it back out. Like Rogan's like one of the few characters who expanded back out a little bit, but even still, I mean, we go nuts. He gets 11 million people an episode. That's like a really, really bad night for Night Court in 1987. Like a terrible night, like a cancelable offense. Right? And so once it gets like that, the motivations to temper your partisanship and say, okay, you know, this Watergate's too serious for making partisan. You can make jokes, but like you can't. That just goes away. So I mean, January 6th is like probably the best thing. No, like 10 minutes, that's off limits, right? But then all of a sudden, like oh no, that's a good way to be outrageous and market. You know, we can show we're actually a little bit to the right of these guys. You know, Newsmax, we're to the right of these guys because we can. And then that's sort of the sales. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good question. All right, who's next? We'll go back up front. Yeah, go ahead.
Dr. Sienkiewicz. So as you said earlier on,
I'm a doctor of television.
Yes, if your TV's broken.
I know exactly how to turn it on.
Yes.
Unless there's two remotes, then it gets very confusing.
It's always tough.
Yeah.
But as you said early on, a lot of people, liberal comedians, let's say in this case, I'm about to ask liberal white comedians, would have said conservatives are not funny.
Yeah.
A lot of those comedians say that dominated the industry, say like, you know, Dane Cook, a lot of bro comedy, as they were challenged by more non-white voices who were in charge of programming or just audiences, and identity became a bigger part of just culture. And you had, you know, Daniel Tosh being taken down for his, you know, rape jokes and sexism, or, you know, a lot of jokes white comedians would make about race and things that are now would now be that were okay in 2005 but that are not okay now. How much of the modern comedy right-wing industry is just a market correction of white comedians? Well, I can't make it as a comedian making rape jokes and race jokes, but I can just be a right-wing comedy comedian now.
Took your while. It's a very smart question. Yeah, Josh is my friend. You don't have to be afraid. I don't know you. We drove up here. So no, this is a very good question. So I mean, there has long been, if you talk to stand-ups, the thing they talk about the right-wing grift, right? I'm not quite making it in the stand-up scene in New York or LA or Chicago generally, but there are niche places you can go, and the bar is lower if you sort of appeal to a certain right. There's less content being produced there. It's a more if you brand yourself as a conservative, there's space there, and I think that's a big part of it. I think that you're saying that there's a certain class of particularly white guys who don't think they can make it in that environment.
Could a political Dane Cook exist?
Yeah, right. That they might. I mean, I don't know, but the question makes sense, and I think that's right. There, undoubtedly. I mean, it's really important to know, right? We look at politicized media and we think of it as politics, but again, it's not politics; it's demographics, right? Fox is right wing, MSNBC is left wing. Well, how did it start? They were both right wing. You know, Michael Savage. I don't know who Michael Savage is, but he was on MSNBC. Right? And they both thought that was the better place to fight. Fox wins, and okay, well, you don't want to go here. All right, so MSNBC goes over here. It's got Rachel Maddow now instead of Michael Savage. Anyway, the point being, what you were saying is that there might be less space on the left because of an egalitarian sort of movement in it, and less taste for apolitical comedy. And as a result, if you look like Dane Cook today, you become a comedian on PragerU, right? Because that like sort of is where you're going to get less resistance on these issues, and the bar is much lower, and the competition's smaller. I think that's right. I mean, the idea of like the Dice Clay, Dane Cook. I mean, we still have Kevin Hart, but Kevin Hart's old, right? I mean, the idea of the arena comic at the moment, it doesn't seem to exist, so I would say generally not. No, but I think you're right, and I think that this notion of markets for both the actual like audiences, but also for comedians who are self-branding is right, and I do think it's where you get a lot of that Legion of Skanks world or whatever. I think that's right.
I wonder if you could define what is comedy to you, what is culture war, and also who are your favorite comedians?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good boy. So comedy is a very boring answer.
And why is it important?
Yeah. So comedy. Have you ever heard of the institutional theory of art? I'll explain that right to another class. It's like academic nonsense. It becomes very hard to define what art is. So some people say, well, art is things that are in museums. Because you go pay a ticket to see art. That's what you see as art. And obviously people who have sort of more refined philosophical notions reject that. But that's kind of how we approach comedy in the book because we study media industry. If it's being sold as comedy, then to us it's comedy. Right? So, a lot of people watch Gutfeld and say, it's not funny, I don't think it's funny. Look at the way that it's marketed. Actually, this is one of my favorite things when it comes to this like liberal rejection. Right? So if you watch, Gutfeld actually had a Super Bowl ad, ran a couple of times. It was like a really quick one, saying he's the king of comedy. All right, they're selling it as comedy. It's comedy for a kind of media industries person. One of my favorite little factoids that came out after the book, Variety, you know what Variety is? It's a trade paper, right? The first week that Gutfeld was the highest rated, he described Gutfeld as a comedy-oriented program. Like they just couldn't, just couldn't get it out. They couldn't say the comedy, it doesn't sound right. Comedy-oriented? What's that mean? I don't know. Right? It means comedy, right? So anyway, if it's being sold as comedy, that's when I'm going to call it comedy in this sort of study of industry. But that I don't think that's quite as sort of basic. And that also means that people are coming to it too often to laugh, but at the very least they're coming to it for playfulness. Right? So it's being sold as playful, it's being bought as playful. That's sort of where I would point to comedy and what we do. What was the second? Culture war. Again, I'm very. So what do I mean by that? I mean taking something, the media tactic of taking something that probably need not be framed in political terms. It could be talked as a basic moral issue or simply an aesthetic issue, right? Is this interesting, whatever, and turning it into a left-right issue. So that's what I mean by that. You could, big sort of right when all talk about is gender stuff, right? And that could be looked at as a mental health issue. That could be looked at as a physical health issue. It could be looked at as a bunch of other issues, but they don't look at any of those elements and talk. They just talk about it as like, oh, you're right wing, so you like this. You're Republican, you like this. Democrat, you like that. We sort of turn it into that binary, as opposed to saying this is an important issue that affects people's lives. My favorite comedians. It's so hard. I'll give one recommendation, which there could be 1,000 things. My favorite comedy thing right now is a podcast called Whatever Happened to Pizza at McDonald's. Anybody ever heard of Whatever Happened to Pizza at McDonald's? This is kind of he actually is quite an interesting progressive guy, Brian Thompson LA. But what it basically is, it's been going. I think it's on like episode 400. It's an investigative journalism report about why McDonald's canceled pizza, which is like the single least interesting, most easily solved mystery possible. Right? And so it's this 400 episodes of him probing. It's very funny, and it's a parody of Serial, essentially, right? It's a parody of sort of the trashy world of true crime, the griftiness of podcasts. Like he does great fake ads for all these exploitative companies that are advertising, right? But he's also investigating. I mean, McDonald's canceled pizza wasn't profitable. That's he solved that, right? But it's 400. It like twists and turns. It creates this whole world. It does have a sort of politics to it, which is like the way people use politics to divide and create culture wars out of nonsense. It's got a conspiracy thing. Like, obviously, every time somebody won't answer his question about why he was canceled, he's like, did they tell you not to say that? But there's a politics. That's a QAnon thing, right, in some ways. And so he's parodying this in a lot of ways. I actually have him coming to Boston College to give a live performance, which, yeah, I don't know. Email me about it, and I'll see if we can get you a video or something. And I wouldn't call it straight political, but it's kind of like the way I like my political comedy often. It's subtextual. You can enjoy it as like just a really silly idea, but also no, he's really getting at sort of the problems with conspiratorial culture, the problems with reactionary culture war, turning this into something. Anyway, that's one recommendation.
Well, yeah.
Matt, can you talk a little bit about what women's role in copyright is?
Yeah, this was something, whenever you're doing anything, you're trying to look for representation of, make sure you're not just seeing something because of your blind spots. The tokenistic nature of women in these things is clear, and so much so that we hardly write about it because, except to say that it tends to be tokenistic. So, Kat Timpf is one of the panelists always on Gutfeld. So she's a female comedian. There are Betsy Fedesi shows up sometimes. The Babylon Bee has some female performers who go into their sketches, but this is all white dudes. I mean, overwhelmingly it is. Which I think somewhat to your point. I mean, there are Diamond and Silk we write about at the end. So which one? Diamond died, right? Yeah, Diamond died. So we talked about Diamond and Silk. So they were two women who did like a double act performance. The last chapter of the book is our trip to CPAC, the COVID CPAC too, February 2020. So Diamond and Silk feature in there, but it's incredibly male dominated, and that's largely for the reasons you think it is, but it also has to do with the fact that the demographic targeting of this stuff is overwhelmingly, again, these lightly or unaffiliated younger men. I don't think it's as white. I think there's evidence that it's more diverse on sort of ethnic and racial identity than in gender. I mean, you can look at like just the chart of like Rogan. And again, Rogan's a weird one in a week. No, but if you look at the chart of Rogan's guests that he has on, like 88% male.
And like a lot of women voted for Trump too, right? I've noticed in New York there's a tendency for people who are trying to define themselves online using memes to push against these broader notions of what all women are fighting for, like where they want to push that they're a little bit more Christian, or they want to push back on some of the things that they, like Roger Stone is coming to town this weekend, and so woman writer is kind of pushing that stuff, which I found very funny coming from that angle, but sort of it still overlaps with the people who are sharing the B type meme.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that I think that Gutfeld is enough in the general consciousness that he knows that he should have some diversity on his panels, and that he should have some women on there. I think most of the rest of his work, the women aren't funny types. Being able to use them as actors in roles, but actual authorial female voices. I mean, there will. I mean, eventually, a voice will emerge, but it's striking. It's just that you can't find it.
Can you give some examples of comedians that are actually funny who are right wing?
Yeah. So I mean,
from our perspective.
Yeah. So the guy that I'll point to is I mentioned Andrew Keefe. I wouldn't. I mean, so he's interesting. Right? It kind of goes to your question about like what is comedy and all this. He is a guy who. So he starts off as like a blue dog Democrat, so working for more conservative leaning Democrats, because that his orientation is again sort of libertarian, but and whatever. These things get hard to define exactly. But the reason swept up into it is maybe a little bit to your point. The places that will sort of hire a guy who looks and sounds like him much more openly. So he was on the Fox Business Channel doing satire. The Fox Business is actually a little bit more ideologically diverse than the rest of the Fox universe was. But also, I watched a bunch of his old stuff, and it's like, oh, really solid sort of mocking, like dumb regulations, these sorts of things. And then there'd be some bullshit Hillary kind of jab, like in the middle of it, which he'd say he didn't write, which I believe him, but they had to be in the show. Anyway, he then ends up it's really, I think it's interesting. I wrote a book about it. He ends up being hired by Glenn Beck to do comedy on The Blaze, and he's interesting. He's bringing on openly transgender people. He's bringing on the various socialists of different kind, having serious conversation, taking it quite seriously. And all goes well, and then he has to have this panel show where Beck is there, and Beck just stares him like bullets every time. He's like, I think I would be interested in what black people think about this racist thing you just said, Tom. And so he gets fired. But he's branded by it. And so he ends up branching on his own in this thing called the Political Orphanage, which is actually bringing in a lot of different political voices, but like the audience trailed him from these spaces, right? But I would basically heartily recommend it. You're not going to love everything he says if you're sort of a real progressive person, but you won't find it offensive. You won't find him saying, whatever. He just really doesn't like taxes, that sort of thing. I wouldn't say Gutfeld overall. I would, but I think if you watched 20 Gutfeld things, you'd find something. And then I guess, I said Michael Malice, I mentioned before, who is just the best troll the internet's got. He's extremely talented at this. And sometimes sort of ideologically hard to read. He'll often just, at the right moment, tweet out an incorrect fact that makes people who are generally a little bit older kind of go nuts. So just when something's happening, like when the Roe versus Wade stuff, he tweets out, this might not make sense on context, but first he'll tweet out, next troll is a tweet, next tweet is a troll, and he'll tweet out after that, something like, because the Bill of Rights has an abortion amendment, it can't be overturned. And he'll get 1,000 people sort of wrapping themselves up over this thing, just sort of chucking in the corner. And if you're watching it from a step back, you're like, oh, this is skillful manipulation. It has an Andy Kaufman kind of thing that's going on, turning people into characters in a play. But then he'll go and hang out with Sam Hyde and then the guys from Daily Storm. So
say objectively, could say Tim Allen. I mean,
sure.
The Santa Claus,
Toy
Story, and so on. I mean, yeah.
Galaxy Quest.
He probably is the broadest of them all. But yeah, let's get.
Yeah, I think we've got time for one more
one
audience
more, okay.
question.
Yeah,
All right. Some we have not heard from. Your hand might have been up first, right here.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, do you think anybody who came up sort of on the right side of the conservative circuit has any desire or ability to move more to the center right and become more of a popular character, or is there just not that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the problem that makes that so hard to see is that insofar as there are big tent institutions, they are still sort of in that center-left world, which has become more partisan. Right? SNL, they would love to hire some of the characters that we're talking about here for sure, but I don't think they will. I think your question is very good, because I do think that one of the two things that could happen, which I think likely will, so one, the contraction of that media universe, right? The idea that everybody doesn't get their own TV show, right? That I think is logical and necessary, just the way capitalism works. And that could take some of the characters that are sort of more moderate in that space and move them in that direction. Also, it's theoretically possible for things to get less partisan. There's no law of physics that says it can't be. It's very hard to see, but they kind of go together in a way, right? If sort of media, if the idea of media strategies having to involve more audience member, broader audiences than it's possible. And the question you ask is, who is the candidate? And I guess I can sort of like maybe try to guess at some, but what I would say is that people move on these lines all the time. We talk with Dennis Miller a lot, who is never a sort of like a leftist of any sort, but he's sort of like a Clinton, Bill Clinton, weird anti-Hillary thing. And then he like drifts to being like, you know, extremely right wing. And so there's no reason people are stuck in their spaces, but the recovery process of moving out, I guess I would say probably not, but I can see people coming up now. I will say this, if you look at new media comedy spaces, you see a lot of innovative stuff, which is not so overtly political. TikTok's probably like there are Dadaist comedy movements on TikTok, and like they don't have sort of so much inherent politics, where there's flexible politics to it. And I can see that be a space that kind of takes the middle, or somebody who does that stuff from a bit of a right-wing perspective, but not sort of openly racist or anything. So, you know, maybe, does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
When you say Dave Chappelle and Louis C.K. have kind of like gotten into this a little, what's happened to them? They've kind of gone into the trans stuff with
Louis for sure, because he had to turn his like public masturbation into a free speech issue somehow.
Yeah, so would you
Right,
say
like-
he's kind of branded as right-wing now?
He's definitely branded as right wing because he does like the Legion of Skanks festivals.
Yeah.
Chappelle is like probably too much to open up as we
Yeah.
finish this
Yeah.
conversation. I think Louis is a fairly simple case of a guy who was very proud to be that center left, not quite tentpole, but certainly like big audience guy who found that the market wouldn't accept him there, but it would.
He used to
at
pride himself as
Skankfest.
being a non-political comedian as well.
Yeah, but also doing things that at least he thought were very progressive in the show and
Yes.
stuff that we could critique.
Yeah.
But he certainly thought of it as that. But then he's like showing it at Skankfest where they like his only thing is that he only did what he did, right, as opposed to something else.
Well, thank you, and go buy the book now.
Thanks so much, everybody.
I-
Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Victoria.
Thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you have not yet purchased a copy of the book, your $5 ticket tonight serves as $5 off a copy or anything else you'd like to buy. And I know that Matt would be more than happy to sign it for you.
Certainly.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Well,
Ross,
What am I?